Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I am so pleased to introduce this event with Edward Melillo, discussing his latest book, The Butterfly Effect: Insects and the Making of the Modern World, joined in conversation by Charles Mann. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science-related literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Coming up in the series on September 30th, we will virtually welcome acclaimed science journalist Katya Moskvich for a discussion of her new book, Neutron Stars: The Quest to Understand the Zombies of the Cosmos. To learn more about this and other upcoming events, you can sign up for the bookstore's email newsletter at harvard.com or check out the page harvard.com/science for more information. We also have a Science Research Public Lecture Series YouTube page where you can watch any previous talks that you might have missed. This evening's event was going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask Ted and Charles something, please go to the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen where you can submit your question. We're going to get through as many as time allows for. Also, once the event begins, I will post a link in the chat to purchase tonight's featured book, The Butterfly Effect. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so a huge thank you for your support. Your purchases and your financial contributions, there will also be a donate link in the chat, make this virtual author series possible, and now, more than ever, support the future of a landmark indie bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you to all of you for tuning in and showing up for authors, for publishers, for indie bookselling, and especially for science, because it really matters. Finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings the last few weeks, technical issues can arise, and if they do, we're going to do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and your understanding. So now, I am very excited to introduce tonight's speakers. Edward Melillo is professor of history and environmental studies at Amherst College and received his doctorate in history from Yale University. In addition, he was awarded the Mellon New Directions Fellowship in 2017. Dr. Melillo is the author of the award-winning Strangers on Familiar Soil: Rediscovering the Chile-California Connection, which won the Western History Association's CAI Prize for Most Distinguished Book on the American West. The book has been hailed as politically astute, ecologically attuned, and beautiful in its execution. He'll be joined on screen tonight by award-winning journalist Charles Mann, a three-time National Magazine Award finalist, a correspondent for The Atlantic, Science, and Wired. His book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, won the National Academy's Communication Award for Best Book of the Year. Tonight, the two will be discussing Ted's new book, The Butterfly Effect, of which Charles writes, "In case after enthralling case, Ted shows how insects have made fortunes, fueled empires, and helped with the creation of great art, all the while making agriculture possible through pollination." Similarly, Bill McKibben praises the book, writing, "Edward Melillo, with great affection and respect, reminds us not to forget that we share the planet with an amazing menagerie of remarkable creatures, many of them six-legged." We are so excited to host them virtually here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Charles and Ted.
Thank you very much for coming. What I'm going to try and do is let you have an experience that I had an experience in 2009 when I walked out of my front door and noticed that I had a new neighbor. And I walked over to meet him, and it turned out it was this guy here, Ted Melillo, an environmental historian. And since I was working at that point on a book that was about environmental history, I was quite excited as a possible new source of ideas and material that I could steal, which I then did. And then, lo and behold, it turned out that we became friends. And so I've known Ted for 11 years. Unfortunately, now lives a few miles away. He's no longer a next door neighbor. So I was extremely excited when he asked me to introduce his book. And so this is a really wide-ranging book that's kind of disguised as a collection of funny stories about people and insects. And so, but that's not really a nice way of describing that. Maybe I should let Ted talk himself about what is your book about, Ted? At some point, you surely have had to tell other people.
Sure. Well, I want to first thank the Harvard Bookstore, and I want to thank Harvard University for sponsoring this event. And also I want to thank my friend, Charles Mann, whom I call Cam, as many of us know him. Yeah, I'm really glad that I moved into that neighborhood and got to know you right away, because I've been able to call upon Cam to speak to many of my history classes over the years. And he beautifully comes in, and now that he's a celebrity, many students will take selfies with him and post them on their Twitter feeds. So Charles is graciously coming into my class next week to talk about 1493 with my environmental history students. So thank you again for agreeing to do this 2 weeks in a row. Yeah, so the book was a lot of fun to write. This book is really about the ways that insects are in us, on us, and around us in our everyday lives, in so many surprising ways, ways that shocked me, in fact, as I was doing the research. The book unfolds in 2 parts. The first part is about 3 insect commodities or products that are ubiquitous in our daily lives, but that we may not actually think about a whole lot. And they're shellac, silk, and cochineal. You may know the first 2. The last is the source of red dye that was the prized possession of Europe's rulers. It was used in ecclesiastical vestments and royal robes to give them deep scarlet red colors. Shellac and silk may be more familiar to you, but you may not know some of the things that I reveal about both insect products in the first half of the book. In the second half of the book, I talk about what I call the hives of modernity, which are these organizations, institutions, and cultural mainstays of our daily lives that are actually inhabited by insect bodies. Pollination, the future of food, and almost all of our knowledge about the human genome are derived from the comings and goings of insects. And I explore all of these themes in ways that bring together the world of science and the world of poetry and theater. And I try to pull together the limbs of the family tree that are my own background. My father's an ecologist and my mother's an English and history teacher. So in my work, I'm always trying to cross those disciplinary boundaries in the way that I was brought up. And I hope some of that emerges in this book. I'll leave it there and see what Cam has for me next.
I was curious, there's a lot of affection for the insect world in this book. This isn't a dispassionate history. This is written by somebody who rather likes bugs. And so, Ted, how did you get into this? I mean, frankly, most people simply do not regard insects with affection. And but you obviously have this. And so what happened here?
Well, I think there's good reason behind why most people don't regard insects with affection. I mean, one can think of the litany of diseases that insect plagues have caused in world history, ranging from malaria to yellow fever to dengue fever to Zika, and insects destroy something like 25% of the goods and services produced in developing nations every year. And the world's farmers spend something on the order of $16 billion on pesticides fighting these creatures. So insects have a bad reputation for good reason. And I've read a lot of wonderful books about all the awful things that insects have done. One of the great ones is by the historian at Georgetown, John McNeill, who writes in Mosquito Empires about the ways that mosquitoes and the diseases they carried really constrained Europe's imperial ambitions in the Atlantic. But I felt it was time to write something of a counterpoint to all of the vast literature bemoaning the awful effects that insects have had on humanity. And my first revelation about this other side to the story came in a class that I've long taught. I began teaching it at Oberlin College in 2007. That was my first teaching job after graduate school. And it's a course called Commodities, Nature, and Society. And in that course, I take students through the histories of silver, silk, coffee, tobacco, sneakers, microchips, units of bandwidth, and human body parts in world history. And we have a lot of fun exploring the trades and transactions of these commodities. And at the end of the course, I always have students do a project tracing the environmental and social histories of a commodity of their choosing. And one student at Oberlin did a project on shellac. And I'd really never thought about shellac before then. But one of the points of his final paper was that shellac was the key ingredient in 78 RPM long playing records. The records that preceded the vinyl era that gets started in the 40s. Before that, records were made out of shellac. And I'd never thought about that before, that this is an insect secretion that really creates the medium for the transmission of modern sound globally. I went, wow. Because I'd been trained as a graduate student in Chinese history and had known about silk. And I'd been trained by a wonderful Latin Americanist at Yale, Gil Joseph, who taught me quite a bit about cochineal, this bug that's raised for its red dye. But I never thought about the third in the trio, shellac. And once I had three, I had enough examples to run with. And I began writing and exploring about those three commodities. And then the project literally took off from there.
So, you know, there's an ancient journalistic rule that if you have three, that's enough to claim a trend. So I can see this is also true in history. But, you know, at the same time, you talk a little bit about the fact that you're kind of primed for this since childhood, in that you were interested, you were a kid who liked bugs.
I was a kid who liked bugs, and it began when I was 11. I took a course at the Woods Hole Children's School of Science in the town where I grew up, Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Many of you probably know it. It's a hub of science. And I took a course with Becky Lash, who's a renowned monarch butterfly expert. And at one point, it was a very hot day. We were in a stuffy classroom, a whole bunch of rowdy 11-year-olds. And Becky put a monarch butterfly on a wedge of watermelon, and it inserted its proboscis into this ripe, juicy fruit. And we all sort of stood there in awe as this insect took a long drink from the watermelon. And we all began to wish that we too could have a drink or a bite of that watermelon. And it brought me closer to a world that had otherwise seemed very alien to me. All of a sudden, I could sort of see myself in that insect. I'm thirsty, I'm hot, I'm taking a drink. And that, I think, was the moment that crystallized for me that there was something more there. And then I talk about in the book how I've had various experiences along the way, seeing the monarch butterfly migration. When I was a grad student in California, I went to a grove of eucalyptus trees in Santa Cruz and saw millions of monarchs roosting, their wings unfurled as they soaked up the sun. And there are just these moments in my life when I've had connections to insects that are beyond the normal ick factor of trying to avoid mosquitoes or swat flies. And I've wanted in this book to really write about those other experiences.
One of the things that's very interesting about your book is that there's quite a few books, as you say, that are about insects from the point of view of entomology. You know, the scientific study of insects, the point of view of natural history. But your book is a book of history, not natural history entirely, but human history. And I was curious about, you know, what is the difference between the way that you work on these subjects as a historian and the way an entomologist might look at them?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, because it gets to the heart of the matter in a lot of ways. I'm not an entomologist. I've tried to bone up on my entomology so that I know enough to be able to talk fairly intelligently about the subjects of my tale, most of whom have 6 legs. But I've also done what I do as a historian in this book, which is to really dig my heels into the primary sources. And that's the thing that excites me as a historian the most, is working with the sources that nobody else has interpreted. There's no other lens between me and these original materials. And so the book actually involves quite a bit of translation. I translated materials from Spanish and from French, and even a bit from Chinese. I had to dust off my rusty Chinese from graduate school to get through a few of the poems here. And there are little tidbits from Portuguese and Italian, where I was really wanting to work with the original sources so that I could be the first interpreter. We all may know the Italian phrase traduttore, traditore. The translator is a traitor. And to a certain extent, when things move through multiple translations, they become more sort of diffused in terms of, and diffuse in terms of their meaning over time. And so one of the things historians do is we go out and seek those original materials. And then we do our synthesis by putting those together in unusual ways. The other thing that I do as a historian, maybe to the chagrin of some of my colleagues, is I'm always trying to think really big and go global whenever I can. But the important thing then to know how to do is when to dive in and give details. And I try to do that as well, so that there's a lot of toggling between, what are the grand narrative arcs here? What are the big stories? But then what are the particular things that are going to get you excited about time traveling? How will you have empathy with people in different times and in places? Well, you'll do that by entering the anecdotal and the particular and the local. But that doesn't mean that the big story can't also be told. And I think it's actually the work of a great editor to help that toggling happen. And you and I both happen to have an amazing editor in John Siegel at Knopf, and he's able to smooth out the wrinkles in that process.
I think that one of the things that's exciting about, as you say, when you get to the primary sources, is that these sources are really the records of human voices, the records of human actions and human deeds. And when you're holding them in your hands, you are bringing somebody back to life, a voice that has been silent for centuries. You have a chance of bringing them, again into existence, even in a small way for the first time. It's really a powerful feeling.
Yeah. And two of the people whose lives I really enjoyed reanimating were Maria Sibylla Merian and Charles Henry Turner. And their stories are actually sort of major nodes in the book. Maria Sibylla Merian is gradually gaining the acknowledgement she deserves, but she's kind of I don't know how many greats to put in front of it, great, maybe add a great grandmother of entomology. And she's long been under-recognized for her pioneering work. She was born in the 1640s in Germany, and with her daughter in 1699, got on board a ship, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, just the two women, and made the first putatively scientific expedition to the Americas. And she did it all self-funded. She sold 225 of her own paintings. And then the two of them took dugout canoes deep into the heart of Suriname, which was a Dutch sugar colony at the time, a brutal slave colony. But the two of them were in pursuit of animals, plants, and predominantly insects. And they spent 3 years cataloging the insect life that they found in Suriname. And this work ended up inspiring E.O. Wilson quite a bit, and Wilson's love for and writing about Suriname in part is a real debt of gratitude to Maria Sibylla Merian. She returned after, ironically, she was bitten by a mosquito and got malaria and had to return to the Netherlands. But when she got back, she published a book of her illustrations. And not only are the paintings absolutely gorgeous, but they did two things that revolutionized the study of insects. First, they showed insects in all of their stages of metamorphosis, the 4 main stages of their life. And nobody had really done that before. Scientists had even thought, and some were starting to refute this, but the stages of an insect's life were actually different organisms entirely. So she upended that. And then secondly, she put insects in their ecological context. And it's hard to imagine how revolutionary that was. We're used to, an Audubon painting in which the bird is shown with the trees that it alights upon on a regular basis or the fruit it might eat. But Merian was being remarkably revolutionary here. Prior to this, many scientists had illustrated insects on a blank canvas, completely devoid of their environmental context. One thinks of Albrecht Dürer's The Stag Beetle from 1505, which is this gigantic beetle on a blank white background. And that was typical of the art of the time, the scientific art of the time. And Merian upended that as well by putting insects on the plants they were eating, in the places they were living, in the sites where they were crawling around. And so she was really remarkable in innovating that way. And I had a lot of fun telling her story in the book. And then the other person I mentioned is someone who should be much better known. Charles Henry Turner He's the first African-American to be published in science. And he was also the first African-American to get a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago. He was born in the 19th century and lived until the 1920s. And he could not get a job at a major research institution because he was Black. And he increased our knowledge about bees in so many ways. He was one of the first to really understand bees and a number of other insects. He studied ants as well, as not simply non-reflexive creatures that were just driven by their instincts, but as animals capable of making choices. And he did his experiments in a park in St. Louis. And he did it all just with virtually no tools. He had no resources, no grad students, no fancy lab. He was a high school science teacher, but his work ended up being of remarkable importance to the study of insects writ large. And so he's another one of those fantastic yet under-acknowledged figures who's key to the history of human-insect relations. And I had a really fun time working on his story as well.
One of the things, you have lots of stories of entomologists and people who study insects as well, and it's striking how many of them are outsiders, like the two people you just mentioned, people who couldn't be, quote unquote, regular scientists. And I wondered if there's something about entomology as a discipline that is particularly welcoming to the types of people who wouldn't be able to study other things.
Yeah, that's a great
not intelligent, you're talking about social reasons, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I pair Charles Henry Turner's story in the book with the story of Carl von Fritsch, who was another pioneer in telling us about how bees pollinate. And his work was done under persecution from the Nazis. He was a man of Jewish descent who had many Jewish scientists, excuse me, many of whom were women, working with him and for him in his labs. And he had to publish his work under the duress of extreme persecution. And he persevered, and fortunately that work got published. And a lot of what we know about the dances that honeybees do in their hive to direct other bees to sources of nectar comes from his work. But maybe, in terms of thinking about your question, there's something to the kind of low bar for entry in that a lot of entomology is done in the field from the very get-go. And it doesn't necessarily require the fanciest of instruments, although there is some entomology being done with incredibly high-tech equipment now, of course. But you can become an entomologist in your own backyard. And in fact, that leads me to think about something that you and I had talked about previously, which is during lockdown, what can you do with your kids that might involve insects that won't get them stung or bitten?
That was my next question, actually. Right,
Might involve enjoyment.
How do you launch the entomological career for your son or daughter?
Right. And I have a 7-year-old, and so I'm thinking about these things. And there are two things that I would put at the top of your list if you're looking for things to do with your kids. The first is, and this is in the epilogue of the book, if you hear a cricket chirping, try counting its chirps for 14 seconds, then add 40 to that number. No fancier math than that. Count its chirps for 14 seconds, then add 40 to that number, and believe it or not, you will get a remarkably accurate measure of the current temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. I've done this and it stunned me. We got within 1 or 2 degrees of the actual temperature. And it's simply because crickets are exotherms. They're beings that their body temperature is intricately dependent upon the ambient temperature outside. And so things slow down when it gets cold and speed up when it's warm. But it's a really fun little thing to do when you hear a cricket. The second thing that we were chatting about that I would highly recommend to people is to get some silkworms and try raising them. And it sounds totally odd, kind of bizarre on the crazy end of the spectrum, but it's very easy to do. And silkworms are wonderful pets. Over the years at the places I've taught, I always get at least 1 or 2 students from China who just think this is absolutely normal. And as kids raise silkworms as pets, it's very easy to do. You go online. I was looking today for about $19. You order one of these kits And a box arrives with a little petri dish full of eggs. And then you just feed them the stuff that comes with it, which is kind of mashed up mulberry leaves. Silkworms eat mulberry leaves. And then these things grow. And their rate of growth, there's nothing like it. Their body weight increases 10,000 times over the 4 to 6 weeks of their life. And they eat 10 times a day. And you and I were talking, we both had experiences listening to silkworm larvae eating. It's really noisy. It's like a giant bowl of Rice Krispies popping. And it's remarkable for kids to get to watch silkworms growing. And you just basically set them on a bed of mulberry leaves and they munch contentedly away. Then they become these big white caterpillars. And then they get ready to spin their cocoons, which are these little sort of hammock-like things that protect them. They've got 2 salivary glands in their heads, and they spin in this sort of hypnotic figure-8 way. And they produce this thing that is the lustrous textile fiber of world history that everybody in history is after. Once the Romans see silk for the first time in 53 BCE, they just go mad about it and they can't figure out how to get their hands on enough of it. And the silkworm
worm, or did they just know the material? Did they actually know what it came from?
They didn't. There's a lot of misunderstanding. The early records think that it's a cotton-like fiber combed off the branches of trees, because it all came from China. China had a relative monopoly on it and closely guarded the secrets of silkworm. It's called sericulture when you raise silkworms. And it's partly because silk is such a remarkable thing. A silkworm's filament can stretch over 3,000 feet, a continuous thread, which, just to put it in relative terms, that's the size of 10 US football fields. A single filament, it's made of 2 filaments actually called brins, but one of these things stretches 3,000 feet long, and you can turn it into fabric that captures light because of the structure of the silkworm filament in really unusual ways. And we all know the relationship between silk and the fashion industry that persists to today. But no, engineers have been bedeviled by silk for generations. They've never produced in the laboratory something that's structurally equivalent to what silkworms can do. And perhaps it's because insects have about 400 million years of advance work on this before we came around. So they've had a little bit of a head start.
Well, this sounds like a case for medieval industrial espionage. You know, Europe sending over spies to try and figure out how all this worked. They did that with porcelain, so you can imagine them doing that with silkworms.
And they did it with cochineal, as I talk about in the book.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yeah, I talk about this. We call him a biopirate. He's sort of a swashbuckling early entomologist, Nicolas Joseph Thierry de Manonville, and he was a French botanist who, in 1776, left France and went on a mission to steal the cochineal insect from Spanish America and bring it to a French colony. Everyone wanted to get their hands on this red dye that comes from the female cochineal insect. And so he went on a mission and he disguised himself as a Catalan doctor. He bought a big gold ring. He had a cane with a diamond on it. And he pretended he was a Catalan physician, and he snuck into rural Mexico, which was part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain at the time. And he goes on a 360-mile walk. He sneaks out of Veracruz and he hikes all the way down to Oaxaca, and he steals a bunch of bugs and the nopal cacti on which they live, hides them in a bunch of crates, and takes them out of New Spain on donkeys, and then sneaks away to Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti later, and tries to raise these things. Unfortunately, he died of a malignant fever. We think he may have died of malaria as well a few years after he reached Saint-Domingue and never got to see the fruits of his own labors. But this is how prized this stuff was. It was Spain's second most lucrative commodity after only silver. And so insects, you're right, have been part of even stories of piracy and espionage in world history.
So one of the things I think we should do maybe at this point is to give you, the listeners, a chance to know not just what TED is like, as you had a chance, but actually what the book is like. It's a lot of fun. It's very thought-provoking. And I was wondering if you might pick out a couple of paragraphs to look at and give people a little taste of what it's like to actually read the book.
Sure, sure. I did this at your cajoling, and I think it sounds like a wise move. I'll read just a short portion of the beginning of the epilogue, and that's called Listening to Insects. And the end of the book, I end the book by thinking about both literally and figuratively what it might mean if we were to pay more attention to insects. So I'll just read about a page of that just to give you a taste of what that is like. What does it mean to listen to insects? The renowned English diarist Samuel Pepys recounted how his countryman Robert Hooke, a natural philosopher, was, quote, able to tell how many strokes a fly makes with her wings, those flies that hum in their flying, by the note that answers in music during their flying, end quote. Indeed, Hooke's ability to recognize the distinctive pitches emanating from various airborne flies has been verified by subsequent research. Like a sonic fingerprint, the wing beat frequency of almost every species of flying insect leaves a unique acoustic trace. This one-of-a-kind buzz, hum, or drone reveals the creature's identity. In the field of human health, wing beat identification of insects has taken off as a way to detect the presence of disease-carrying mosquitoes. Using a sensor equipped with a laser beam, scientists can measure the wing beat frequency of minuscule airborne fauna to determine which insects are present in any given environment, from a savanna in Tanzania to a swamp in Louisiana. Undeniably, the whines and buzzes of bugs have been the harbingers of plagues and pestilence throughout human history. Nevertheless, in other times and places, their sonorous chirps, trills, and hums have been more pleasing to the ear. An ode to cicadas by the 1st century BCE Greek poet Meleager of Gadara artfully expresses this attitude. O shrill-voiced insect that with dewdrops sweet, inebriate dost in the desert woodlands sing, perched in the spray top with indented feet, thy dusky body's echoing harp-like ring. Come, dear cicada, chip to all the grove, the nymphs and pan, a new responsive strain, that I in the noontime sleep may steal from love, reclined beneath the dark overspreading plain. The ancient Greeks were not alone in their high regard for insect songs. On autumn evenings during Japan's Edo period from 1603 to 1868, couples would flock to Tokyo's Dokkan Hill, a popular spot for spreading picnic blankets, sipping sake, and listening to the bug concerts known as mushikiki of chirping crickets and sonorous cicadas.
Thank you. It's terrific. You know, one of the things that strikes me is that not only is it seems like just a sort of a good idea for learning to listen to insects, but there's so many of them, it just seems foolish not to pay attention to them. And one of the things that your book does so well, I think, is to give us something of the flavor of the enormous variety, diversity, and sheer presence, omnipresence of insects. And just the numbers that you trot out are staggering of how many there are and how many diverse varieties there are, that even though I sort of know this already, to see it in black and white it's just really astounding.
Yeah, I was blown away when I started doing reading on this from entomologists. Entomologists estimate that on our planet right now, there are 10 quintillion insects moving about. That's, my son and I wrote it out on a paper, and we had to actually swirl around in an S shape to get all the zeros. It's 10 followed by 18 zeros. There's a quote, one of my favorite quotes from the entomologist J.B.S. Haldane. In the 1920s, he encountered a group of theologians. He was an Indian-born British entomologist, and the theologians asked him, they said, Professor, what do we know about the creator and his nature from your study of the environment? And Haldane apparently answered, an inordinate fondness for beetles. There's something like 350,000 species of beetles, far outnumbering the species numbers of any other animal on the planet. And they're just everywhere, but often the things they're doing are out of sight, out of mind. They're among the blades of grass, or they're behind the refrigerator, under the trash can. And so we don't see or think about them. But there's a woman named Michelle Troutwine who works in California. She's an entomologist, and she and her group of scientists have done studies of basically every house, from Parisian apartments to Peruvian bungalows, and have found that there are just insects everywhere all the time, moving about among us. This may freak out some folks, but behind us, between us, around us, and that they're with us all the time, in other words.
Well, even more than that, you may recall Lynn Margulis, the late great biologist at the University of Massachusetts, who is very fond of pointing out that insects and microorganisms are, 99% plus of the world's biomass. You and I and everybody listening in the entire world are just a little epiphenomenon. And for this reason, she would always say that things like saying save the planet. Why, that's ridiculous, she would say. The planet is just fine. Long after we're gone, the insects and the microorganisms will be here. And
in a lot of ways,
what counts.
Yeah, and we depend upon them far more than they depend upon us in so many ways. And that's shown, and I try to work on showing that throughout the book in a whole bunch of ways, especially with pollination.
Mm-hmm.
Take something like California's almond crop. It takes, I think it's 31 billion honeybees to pollinate 1.5 million acres of almond trees in California. It's the United States' 7th most prominent agricultural export, shipped all over the world. When you open that bag of almonds on the airplane, or you drink a glass of almond milk or add it to your coffee, that's all coming from California. And without those bees don't live locally. They're brought in on the backs of flatbed trucks in gigantic operations, trucked across the country to pollinate this massive crop. And if you've driven through California's Central Valley, you just drive for hours and hours and hours, and you see, well, you may not see it in the haze of the smoke currently, but you would normally see almond tree after almond tree, just grove after grove after grove of these plants that are totally contingent for their very existence on honeybees. And for me, that was one of the examples that really crystallized how central these sort of insect bodies are to our foodways and the future of food. So
one of the things that's also sort of lurking in the background of your book, and you touch on it a few times, is that not only are they enormously important to life on Earth and our lives as well, but because of we fail to listen to them, we're kind of wrecking, the insect world. There's plenty of insects around, but not necessarily the ones we want and the ones we need. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, this sort of paradox that there's absolutely staggering numbers of them, yet at the same time, we're really having malign effects.
Yeah, there are absolutely staggering numbers of them, but those numbers in many cases are in rapid, radical decline. Mm-hmm. Upwards of 40% of insect species are in decline, and about a third of them are endangered. And so, in recent years, the New York Times had a cover story on one of their Sunday magazines about the insect apocalypse. And some of it seems hyperbolic, but it's actually a real question that scientists are asking about what does the future hold for many of the most important species that play key roles in so many ecosystem functions, whether it's decay or pollination or more mundane things. I try to bring to light also the role that they play economically. Mm-hmm. And many people are not aware of it, but I love to be teaching at the front of a classroom. I'm doing it via Zoom now, but when I'm actually standing in a lecture hall in the morning, teaching a morning class, there's almost always a student holding a cup of yogurt and another student eating an apple. And I'm looking out at them and thinking, do you know that there are 2 insect products in those things that you're eating? The fruit on the bottom, yogurt, the red in the strawberry dye comes from cochineal, and the apple's coated in shellac. It's the thing that makes it look shiny and keeps its water in on the shelf at the grocery store. And when I mention this to the students, there's always a bit of the ick factor that emerges at first, and then the realization that, oh, wow, yeah, there are insects here. I've had football players in my classes who come in eating exo bars after their morning practices, and they haven't looked closely at the ingredients always and don't realize that the protein in those bars comes from cricket meal. It's freeze-dried, ground up, pulverized crickets. And that's the new wave. That's where everybody, Bill Gates and Mark Cuban and the Twitter co-founder Biz Stone, they're all putting their money on cricket meal as the future of protein. And I talk quite a bit in the book about entomophagy, eating insects, a way that all the prognosticators are talking about the future of food and its relationship to insects.
It sounds a little bit less unlikely when you realize that it would just be another way to express our dependence on the insect world. We're starting to get questions, and so I thought I might take a look at them. One from Glenn, who says that insects make all sorts of appearances in early historic and ancient documentation. You know, for example, accounts of invasive insects like locusts and their impacts in societies. And he asks, to what extent do insects appear in small scale and then large scale impacts appear in the world's archaeological record?
Yeah, I talk about that quite a bit in the book, and it was really fascinating to go back and think about the history of honey hunting and cave paintings in Spain, and looking at those as early records of our relationship with wild insects. And the archaeological record in China is also replete with early fragments of gathered wild silk. And I write about that and talk about that and had a lot of fun looking at that. Insects in the long distant past were much bigger than they are now. And the archaeological record has also revealed things like Meganeura monyi, which was an insect that was as large as a hawk. It was gigantic. It must have been an intimidating presence in prehistoric skies. But because of changing oxygen levels in the Earth's atmosphere, it was not able to survive. Insects don't breathe with lungs. They breathe osmotically through spiracles or small holes in their exoskeleton. And so oxygen becomes a real limiting factor for insect body size. But yeah, there's all sorts of fascinating records and places where insects appear in the archaeological record. And I try to touch upon quite a few of those throughout the book. Another really fascinating one is sort of a pre-modern insect commodity that I write about quite a bit, that makes up both the archaeological record and some of the textual record for ancient historians, is iron gall ink, which is produced from the tannic acids when a type of wasp bites an oak tree. And it's the source of the ink on which, with which the Declaration of Independence is written. And many of Shakespeare's works were written in iron gall ink. And the Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of the first early written records of the New Testament, is written in this ink that's an insect product. And so both the deep archaeological record and then the ancient textual record, of which we have, fortunately quite a bit left, is replete with insects and their products. And for me as a historian, that was one of the most exciting things to explore.
So Sarah writes that she runs the Bug of the Month Club for children in California and loved your book. And she asked, do you have any idea how humans figured out how to get shellac from scale insects and how it could be used?
Yeah, so that was perhaps the most challenging chapter to write, was my chapter on shellac, because it goes back deep into ancient Indian history. The Mahabharata and many ancient Indian texts are full of references to shellac, and its initial discovery is hard to pin down, but I tell a bit about the deep history of its uses. And the fascinating thing about shellac is it's still produced in largely the same way as it was produced centuries ago. And that is that these scale insects are gathered, and I presume somebody gathered them at some point on one of the twigs from a figure acacia tree on which these are raised, and then scraped it off, and it might have melted in the hot sun, and somebody found a use for it. But placing that is very difficult because shellac's one of the commodities I write about where there's very little historical writing on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to literally piece together, you know, these articles from obscure Indian scientific journals from the early 1900s and get into a lot of detailed historical work to put that part of the story together. But one of the things that I try to, one of the big stories that I tried to tell in this book is the way that these seemingly ancient commodities have made a remarkable reappearance. And this might be something to share with the Bug of the Month Club, that all these things have made huge comebacks. And that the bug of the month in many ways is all these things that are in us, on us, and around us all the time. And dental filling shellac is present. I was at a dentist appointment at one time and asked the dentist to show me what was on the ingredients list of the substance he was putting into my mouth. And he was rather surprised that I asked for this. And then I looked at the bottle of the filling ingredient that he was using, and indeed shellac was there. And largely because, you know, after the Second World War, we thought that we were going to replace the substances of nature with synthetic products. And then as it turned out, most of those substitutes were toxic to the human body, were carcinogenic. And so insect products like shellac and cochineal have made a comeback because they're non-toxic. And so they're in everything. Bodies are preserved with them now. It's the replacement from formaldehyde is shellac. And shellac, it's the enteric coating for most pills that you take because it slows the digestion of the medicine in your stomach. And shellac is coating the Halloween candy that your kids get when they trick or treat, because it's the thing that keeps the candy shiny. You know, maybe the Bug of the Month Club could look at a pack of Skittles someday, and they will find that both shellac and carmine, which is the sort of masquerade word for cochineal, are in the ingredients list.
So anonymous attendee asks a question that every writer sort of both wants to hear and doesn't want to hear, which is there anything you found particular reason, but for whatever reason had to cut out of the book? In other words, is there something, is there a chapter somewhere that you're mourning that you weren't able to put in?
Oh yeah, thanks for that question, because, you know, the cutting room floor is covered in all sorts of fantastic material, as Cam and I both know. We could probably write many a book based on the things we had to excise for practical reasons. I think the thing that I would most want to go back to, that I began to find a lot of information about but didn't have the room to write about, is Charles Henry Turner.
Mm-hmm.
Because his story as this pioneering African-American scientist and entomologist is so fascinating that I may end up actually picking up some of the material and writing something more, because I began to work on this. And the neat thing about working on his story was how many people kind of came out of the woodwork and contributed little elements to that. I got some photographs from a professor out in Indiana, and I got some material from another fellow down in Georgia. And I could really imagine taking those fragments of the research and pursuing them. There are many other stories I could tell about the things that didn't make it into the book that I would love to pursue, but that would be probably at the top of the list.
So another anonymous person says, for both of us, I guess, what's the best book you've read in quarantine?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Well, I'm rereading Moby Dick because I plan to write a book about it down the road, and I think Moby Dick is a great quarantine book, perhaps because, I mean, there's something of the plague ship to it. We're all floating around in hermetically sealed containers to a certain extent. So I'll leave it at that, but that would be my quarantine book of choice, is Moby Dick.
It would be hard for me because I have this stack of books that I haven't read. And the reason I haven't read them is that I got 15 to 20 pages into them and realized they were good, and therefore didn't want to be trying to sandwich them in between other things. And so this, I guess, has provided the opportunity to do that. Not that it's worth to have a gigantic global pandemic for it. And so one of the ones that I really enjoyed was an early book by Diane Johnson called The First Mrs. Meredith. And it's a biography of the poet George Meredith's first wife. And it turns out it's a pioneering feminist classic that I guess if I was better read and more knowledgeable, I would know about. And it's this absolutely charming book that focuses on the figure of, the great man, this famous poet, and then these sort of figures around him in the family who are always in the shadows. And it's a book about all those people who never, get any ink. And it's charming and funny and extremely pointed. I just thought it was terrific. So, Dale asked, are crickets the same as cicadas? They seem to start chirping around the same time every summer, announcing the beginning of a shift towards late summer, which is clearly what we're having right now.
Yeah. No, they're not. They're actually different species, but it's a good question because it allows me to do something which I should have done at the beginning, which is define my terms. And I want to make sure I do that accurately for the entomologists in the audience and for the rest of us. Cicadas are examples of true bugs. They're part of the taxonomic order Hemiptera. That includes things like aphids and cicadas, and they've got piercing and sucking mouth parts and specialized forewings. So actually, when we call other insects bugs, it's a misnomer. Although cochineal and shellac are actually produced by true bugs. In Britain, it's kind of funny because bug means bed bug, as I found out when I was in London. Bug doesn't mean just any insect. But cicadas are part of the true bugs, and I believe that crickets are not. I'll check on that after this. But that's one of the distinctions.
Well, you talk about how the, when you hear about a bug in the system, that it was actually an insect. There was actually a real bug in a real system that caused that phrase. And now I'm wondering if, well, you should first tell that story, and wondering if it applies to England now.
Well, and it was actually Grace Hopper.
Right.
I love the name is Grace Hopper because it sounds so much like grasshopper. Was another pioneering woman whose story I tell in the book. She was a computer engineer who was working on Harvard's mainframe in the 1940s, and there was a problem with the electrical wiring, and they literally discovered a moth stuck in the electrical wiring, and she taped it into her journal and wrote next to that entry in her journal, "This was the bug in the system." And Yale is actually renamed a college after her because they decided, as a result of student protests, which I was part of as a grad student, and many students have joined in, they wanted to not have it named after John Calhoun, who was an awful guy who owned slaves and did a bunch of despicable things. And so they renamed it Hopper College. So Grace Hopper now has a college at Yale named after her, and the accolades she deserves for all of her pioneering work in computer science, but she's also the originator of the expression, the bug in the system, and it was quite literally a bug in the system.
So we also have a question from Dale. Normally I wouldn't ask, because his question consists of the words E.O. Wilson ? And the only reason I can do this is I'm going to put you on the spot and tell you about your family's role in nearly assassinating Dr. Wilson.
Well, it wasn't a near assassination, but you and I have talked about this story, and my father may be on here, so he can correct me if I get this wrong. But he told me a story once about he used to bike commute in the morning from the town of Falmouth to Woods Hole, which is where his laboratory was, the ecosystem center at the Marine Biological Laboratory. And early one morning, he was biking along the bike path between Falmouth and Woods Hole. There was quite a bit of fog that had come in off the water. And he slammed on his brakes when he saw a huddled figure crouched on the bike path. And as he got closer, he realized it was E.O. Wilson, and he was on his hands and knees following a line of ants as they marched across the bike path. And that was the sort of commitment to science. It also goes to show that entomology can be done with very little equipment. And produce extremely fantastic results, as E.O. Wilson's work does. Charles and I were talking earlier, though, about how I quote both Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould, his nemesis in the book, and maybe I try to create a bit of rapprochement between those two Harvard scientists who didn't get along so much, but both of their work was extremely crucial for me and my own development as a thinker. And I talk about Wilson, especially his love for Suriname. I was fascinated by that as I was writing about Maria Sibylla Miron, and I make that connection there and had a lot of fun thinking about that. So
we have a, oops, sorry.
I was just going to say we have time for one or two more questions. We should wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, so anonymous attendee, who I'm assuming is not the same as the previous couple of anonymous attendees, asks, what kind of next projects are you looking at? Yes, both of us. So, I'm willing to start, or you want to start?
Yeah, you start. I'm so excited about your next project that I want to hear a little more too. So I could be the anonymous questioner on this one.
Right. I'm writing, I wrote a book called 1491, which is about the Americas before Columbus. And this is sort of an offshoot of that. And it's a history of the North American West, the West. And the basic idea is that if you think about, we know something about what is going to happen in the West, not in the terms of we know who's going to be the governor of Colorado in 2050 or something like that, but we know, for example, that it's going to be hotter and drier than it is now. That would just be astonishing if it weren't the case. We know, for example, that it's going to be roughly, a third to 45% people of Hispanic origin. We know that there's going to be a heavy presence of Asians along the shore. We know also that, and this is something I would argue, and is probably the most iffy part of this, that the 270 odd indigenous nations in the West have been rapidly regaining their sovereignty for the last 30 or 40 years. And so if that arc continues, somewhere in the latter third of the century, we're going to have a couple of hundred semi-independent nations in the West. And so there will be a radically altered regime of sovereignty. And if you think about it, the history of the West that you learn now is all about Lewis and Clark and the wave of European settlement and how nature was tamed, and the West sort of disappears. And that just isn't very adequate to the kind of future that we can see coming up. And so I decided to write a history of that future, a history that would be useful maybe 20 or 30 years from now.
That sounds wonderful. I'm excited to read it.
Right.
Maybe
well, it's partly inspired. There's a great Bruce Sterling quote that says, to write about the past, you first have to understand the future. And and I thought, well, that's crazy. And then I thought, no, I actually understand what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the idea. But tell me what you would like to do. You mentioned doing something about Herman Melville.
Yeah, so I have 2 projects in the works, and I'm still figuring out which one comes first. But I have one project I'm working on is about Herman Melville, Moby Dick, and the making of the great American novel. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my work is on the Pacific world, the Pacific Ocean, the people's ecosystems and cultures in and around the Pacific Ocean. And I kind of want to follow Melville on his journeys through the Pacific and figure out how this man whose book only sold about 3,000 copies during his lifetime was redeemed from his own castaway status, and the book was redeemed. That's why I've been reading Moby Dick in lockdown. But there's another project I'm also working on that's based on a year I spent learning the Hawaiian language in Hawaii during a Mellon New Directions Fellowship. And it delves into the tragic trip that the king and queen, King Liholiho and Queen Kamamalu, took from Hawaii to Britain in 1823 and 1824. They went to meet with King George and died of measles. And they were negotiating a diplomatic treaty actually to protect against colonial incursions from other European powers. And on the way back, one of the survivors of the measles, a man named Boki, who was the governor of Oahu, stopped in Brazil, picked up 30 plants and brought them back to his estate on Oahu, and which is right where the UH campus is located now. And he planted them, and they turned out to be coffee plants, and they became coffee. And so the story is about two voyages and the way they were intertwined in both environmental history and diplomatic history. And it's a bit of a what if. What if Hawaii had become a British protectorate and not a US state? But also, how did the movements of coffee shape the world of caffeination? Here I am drinking my coffee. By the way, the USDA allows 10% of imported coffee beans to be insect body parts. So if you thought you weren't eating or drinking insects, think again.
That's perhaps we should wrap it up with this. Thank you so much, Ted, for chatting. Thank you very much in the audience for listening, and thank you to the Harvard Bookstore. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to do this.
And thank you, Charles, for doing this. Thanks to Cam and Kate.
Thank you, guys. I also read Moby Dick very recently, so good choice.
It's really weirdly good, isn't it?
It's weirdly good, I agree. I loved the whaling chapters. Well, thank you once again to both of you for this lovely event, and thank you to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. Please feel free to learn more about the book and purchase The Butterfly Effect on Harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well.